Chapter 5.4 Love Indoctrination. Ever since Charles Darwin published his natural selection explanation for the origins of the great variety of life on Earth in 1859, all manner of theories have been put forward to suggest how one species, namely our species, managed to defy the essential selfish nature of the natural selection process and develop unconditionally selfless moral instincts. Indeed, in response to the great build-up of anxiety in the world about the now desperate plight of the human race and the resulting urgent need for the relieving answers that are being presented in this book, especially answers to the questions of the origin of our species' moral nature and present human condition-afflicted lack of compliance with it, almost every edition of every science journal over the last 10 years has either presented or discussed a new theory that attempts to account for our moral sense. But of all these theories, a brief history of which will be presented in Chapter 6, only one provides the fully accountable and thus adequate, true explanation for the origins of our moral sense, which is that it was achieved through nurturing, a mother's maternal instinct to care for her offspring. However, as will be acknowledged shortly in Chapter 5.7 and described in detail in Chapter 6, the problem with this nurturing explanation and why its early permutations were discarded by the scientific establishment is that it has been an unbearably confronting truth. It is only now that we can explain the human condition and thus understand why the present human condition-afflicted human race hasn't been able to adequately nurture our infants to the extent their instincts expect, that it becomes safe to finally admit that nurturing is what made us human, that it was nurturing that gave us our moral soul and created humanity. So how did nurturing create our extraordinary, unconditionally selfless moral instincts? Genetic traits for nurturing are intrinsically selfish, which, as has been emphasised, genetic traits normally have to be if they are to survive, because through our mother's nurturing and fostering of offspring who carry her genes, her genetic traits for nurturing are selfishly ensuring their reproduction into the next generation. However, while nurturing is a genetically selfish trait, from an observer's point of view, it appears to be unconditionally selfless behaviour. The mother is giving her offspring food, warmth, shelter, support, and protection for apparently nothing in return. This point is most significant because it means, from the infant's perspective, its mother is treating it with real love, with unconditional selflessness. The infant's brain is, therefore, being trained or indoctrinated or inscribed with unconditional selflessness, and so, with enough training in unconditional selflessness, that infant will grow into an adult who behaves unconditionally selflessly. Apply this training across all the members of that infant's group, and the result is an unconditionally selflessly behaved, cooperative, fully integrated society. The trick in this love indoctrination process lies in the fact that the traits for nurturing are encouraged or selected for genetically, because the better the infants are cared for, the greater are their and their nurturing traits' chance of survival. The process does, however, have an integrative side effect in that the more infants are nurtured, the more their brains are trained in unconditional selflessness. There are very few situations in biology where animals appear to behave selflessly towards other animals. Normally, they each selfishly compete for food, shelter, territory, and mating opportunities. Maternalism, a mother's fostering of her infant, is one of the few situations where an animal appears to be behaving selflessly towards another animal. And it was this appearance of selflessness that exists in the maternal situation that provided the integrative opportunity for the development of love indoctrination, the training of individuals in unconditional selflessness. And with this unconditionally selfless behaviour recurring over many, many generations, the unconditionally selfless behaviour will become instinctive. A moral soul will be established, because genetic selection will inevitably follow and reinforce any development process occurring in a species. The difficulty was in getting the development of unconditional selflessness to occur in the first place, for once it was regularly occurring, it would naturally become instinctive over time. But for a species to develop nurturing, to develop this trick for overcoming the gene-based learning system's seeming inability to develop unconditional selflessness, it required the capacity to allow its offspring to remain in the infancy stage long enough to allow for the infant's brain to become trained or indoctrinated with unconditional selflessness or love. In most species, infancy has to be kept as brief as possible because of the infant's extreme vulnerability to predators. Zebra foals, for example, have to be capable of independent flight almost as soon as they are born, which gives them little opportunity to be trained in selflessness. But as the photo appearing here of a rhesus monkey trying to carry its infant illustrates, walking on three limbs with one arm holding an infant is clearly difficult when not fully bipedal, and suggests the reason for bipedalism. Being semi-upright as a result of their tree-living, swinging from branch to branch arboreal heritage meant primates' arms were largely freed from walking and thus available to hold dependence. Infants similarly had the capacity to latch onto their mothers' bodies. This freedom of the upper body meant primates were especially facilitated for prolonging their offspring's infancy and thus developing love indoctrination. It follows that the longer infancy is delayed, the more and longer infants had to be held, and thus the greater need and, therefore, selection for the arms-freed, upright walking ability known as bipedalism. When I first put forward this nurturing love indoctrination explanations for humans' unconditionally selfless moral nature in a 1983 submission to Nature and New Scientist, see www.humancondition.com/nature, I said, contrary to prevailing views, that it meant bipedalism must have developed early in this nurturing of love process. And, in fact, as will be discussed in more detail shortly, the early appearance of bipedalism in the fossil record of our ancestors is now being found. For instance, in 2012, it was reported that the oldest hominins currently known are Sahelanthropus chadensis, dated to between 6 and 7 million years ago, which the fossil records suggest stood and walked bipedally. But while bipedalism was the key factor in developing nurturing and thus love indoctrination, other influences also played a pivotal role, most notably the presence of ideal nursery conditions. This entailed uninterrupted access to food, shelter and territory, for if any element was compromised or other difficulties and threats from predators excessive, then we can assume there would have been a strong inclination to revert to more selfish and competitive behaviour. The successful nurturing of infants therefore required ample food, comfortable conditions, and security from external threats over an extended period. But in addition to these practical factors, to ensure the success of the love indoctrination process, it wasn't enough to simply look after infants. They had to be loved. And so maternalism became about much more than mothers simply protecting, providing for, and training their infants in life skills. It became about demonstrably loving them. Significantly, we speak of motherly love, not motherly protection, provision and training. So, in addition to the prerequisites of, firstly, a physiology that facilitated an extended infancy, and secondly, ideal nursery conditions, What was also required for love indoctrination to occur was the presence and influence of more maternal mothers. Of course, the difficulty with selecting for more maternal mothers is that their genes don't tend to endure because their offspring tend to be the most selflessly behaved, too ready to put others before themselves, leaving the more aggressive, competitive and selfish individuals to take advantage of their selflessness. Such selfish opportunism could, however, be avoided if all members of the group were equally well nurtured with love, equally trained in selflessness. This situation being yet another of the delicate conditions that has to be maintained if love indoctrination is to develop. For any breakdown in nurturing within a group that is in the midst of developing love indoctrination could jeopardize the whole situation and see it revert to the old state of the each for his own opportunistic, all-out competition where only dominance hierarchy can bring some peace, selfish genes rule, animal condition. It can be seen, then, that while the development of unconditional selflessness through the love indoctrination process of a mother's nurturing care of her infant was possible, it was not easy. Even for the exceptionally facilitated primates, which explains why none of the primate species apart from our ape ancestors have been able to complete the development of love indoctrination to the point of becoming fully integrated. While, as will shortly be described in Chapter 5.6, bonobos are on the threshold of this achievement, the evidence so far indicates that it has only been our ape ancestors who managed to complete the process, the result of which is our species' unconditionally selfless, genuinely altruistic, universally loving, instinctive self or soul, the voice or expression of which is our moral conscience. Before concluding this section, it is important to note that this love indoctrination process involved an indoctrination or training in unconditional selflessness, not an understanding of it. The search for knowledge still had to take place, which is why the human condition producing clash between our instincts and conscious intellect occurred. The process by which love indoctrination liberated consciousness will be introduced in Chapter 5.8 and fully explained in Chapter 7.